So we'll move on to our last talk, who is going to be given by Arie, who needs very little introduction for this crowd. But Arie is a professor of economics at USC and also director of our USC Center for Economic and Social Research. So Arie, I will turn it over to you.
So this is a very simple exercise. I just want to illustrate or investigate, if you like, how an internet panel can detect movements in society maybe a little quicker than more traditional ways of collecting data. And the example here is the effect of the pandemic on the job market. So this is a graph of the kind that Jill showed earlier in her presentation. So these are graphs that we produce a few thousand of these every night. And these are weekly averages of various things we're interested in. In this particular case, this graph shows the percent of people who had a job at any given time. And so the way the tracking survey worked, it started on March 10. And so the first survey was just a 3-week field period. And then on April 1st, we started the true tracking survey, where we had a 2-week periodicity, and then every day in the 14 days, there was 1/14 of the sample was invited to answer our questions. And the reason why I'm saying this, if you look at the left, this graph is sort of a strange shape because it starts at about 62% or so, and then it jumps up and then it comes down. And the reason for that is really only that since we fielded on March 10, by March 20 or 25, most of the respondents had answered. So the dots sort of close to April 1st on the March side are really based on very few observations. So after this sort of complicated introduction, the main point here is that if you look at March and then you look at April, there is a fall in the number of jobs by about 20% or so, maybe a little less. It goes from, I think, from 62 to 50 or thereabouts. Of course, there were other data points that suggested that something very dramatic was happening. For example, Opportunity Insights produced this graph about spending in early April, and it actually falls by about 30% compared to mid-March, and then it sort of comes up a little bit to minus 20%. Opportunity Insights also, they have data on the number of hours worked in small businesses, and there you even see a drop of 60%, and then it goes up a little bit to maybe minus 40 or minus 45 or thereabout. So given all that, one would expect that then when the April unemployment numbers would be published, and that happened by BLS early May, that they would also show about a 20% unemployment rate. And sure enough, that was not what happened. And I'm sure we all remember these names, these numbers. The unemployment rate that was published was actually 14.7%, which was much less than I certainly had anticipated. So the answer why this is the case, or the solution of the puzzle, if you like, is really given by BLS itself. And I think this story is well known. It has been publicized. Several people have written about it. But it's worth repeating because I'm going to use this to see how what we see here matches with what our own data told us. So if you go to if you look at this table, and again, this comes from BLS, from their own explanation. So you see here data by year. So we have data for 2016 to 2020. Then in March, we see a column total employed, and we see 150 million, 152 million, 155 in 2020. And then in April, so now we go total employed in April, it's sort of the same numbers, 151, 153, and then it falls to 133. So that's the drop in employment, and that drives the unemployment increase. But the really interesting columns are the columns that say with a job not at work in March, and then also for April. So with a job not at work are things like on vacation, ill for a while, but you still have a job. And if you look at the March numbers over the years, they're sort of around 5, and then actually go up in 2020 to about 6.5 million. In April, you see similar numbers to the March numbers, sort of 4 and 5. But then, of course, in 2020, it suddenly jumps from 4 to about 11.5 million. So this is an increase by 7.5 million. And BLS itself, and actually the Bureau of the Census, because they do the field work, then explains that they think it's really mainly because of a misunderstanding by their interviewers of the instructions. So what I think probably happened is that many employees who got furloughed were actually classified as having a job but not at work. And in the definition of unemployment by BLS, furloughed means that you have to be counted as unemployed. And if you do that, then the number is really not 14.7%, but it sort of gets more to 19%. And moreover, since some people would no longer say they were seeking employment, because I guess at that point it might feel like it's impossible to find anything. If you add that, you even get to about 20% or so. Now, that's not the only thing that's going on. There's a couple of papers that have looked at the BLS, or rather the CPS numbers, because these are really numbers that come from CPS. And there's sort of a couple of things that that have had an effect. So first of all, understandably, in April, Bureau of the Census moved to telephone interviewing only, whereas normally what happens is the first interview of an 8-month rotating panel is really in person, and then they do telephone interviews later. Now, the thing with the telephone interviews is it turns out that the in-person interviews, you're more likely to have to find people who have less attachment to the labor market. So if you only do telephone interviews, you're more likely to miss people who have less attachment to the labor market. So in other words, you're more likely to miss people who have a higher probability of being unemployed. And the other part is that CPS is a rotating panel. It's an 8-month rotating panel. And so what has been found over the years is that during this 8-month period, the measured employment actually goes up in these groups. So the longer someone is in the panel, the more likely that person is to be employed. And I guess one reason is selective attrition, because there is a connection between the probability of being unemployed and the probability of actually responding to all of this. So all of this points to the fact that the BLS number certainly during this period may actually have been way understating the unemployment rate. And so I can sort of illustrate that with the numbers we had. So we can just compare what we had, what they have. So what I have here is just the graphs of jobs measured by BLS. These are blue bars in March, April, and May. And then in the UAS, and these are the orange bars. And in March, you see that the UAS a little higher, and then in April, both fall, both BLS and UAS fall quite a bit, but you see that certainly relatively speaking, BLS doesn't fall as much. And then in May, you see that both are going up a bit, but BLS going up more. So that's not surprising, because that's sort of consistent with the story I just told. If we now sort of redefine employment in the BLS by no longer including the people who were classified as having not being at work but having a job, then you get the gray bars. So the gray bars are now, you might say, the corrected definition of employment. Of course, in March, the gray bars and the blue bars are the same. But now in April, you see that the gray bar is now actually quite a bit lower than the blue bar. And that reflects the fact that we have now moved these misclassified people to the unemployment column. And then in May, you still see that the gray bar is lower than the blue bar, but the difference has become a little less. And both UAS and BLS suggest that employment has actually gone up between April and May. And of course, you can do the same thing. So these are really the same data, but slightly more visually striking. Just you can, of course, also calculate implied job loss. And if you look at April, then you see that the gray bar for BLS is much bigger than the blue bar. So the implied job loss is just a lot bigger if you once again redefine employment, and similarly for May. And then the other day, I just happened to see a graph in the New York Times, which came from a presentation by the chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, to Congress. And they had also recalculated unemployment rate. So the blue line here is unemployment according to the BLS definition. And then the middle line, the sort of yellowish line, is what you get if you recalculate unemployment pretty much along the lines that I suggested. And if you look at the yellow line, you do actually see it sort of touches 20% in April. And you can ignore the red line, because that's yet another exercise that that's not relevant for us today. So all of this points to the fact that probably, by most measures, the unemployment rate really was about 20% in April, and probably stayed quite a bit higher than we may have thought if we just looked at BLS. BLS. So now all of this, of course, now feels like, well, I'm just trying to sort of, hitting BLS, but I think that's not really the point. First of all, BLS has been very open about the way they present the numbers and everything that's going on. But the point here was really to argue that our early, pretty much real-time UAS numbers seem to be consistent with what you find from other sources once you sort of dig into what these other sources are really telling you. Now, this is sort of a nice story, but of course we can do more, because we can also look at how do our numbers compare to BLS numbers going forward after May, if you like. And so what you get is really this. So the first couple of months on the left are really the same numbers I showed before, but I showed them in bar charts. Now I show them in graphs. And then if you go to the right, you see that the gray line is once again the corrected line, and gradually that sort of overlaps with the blue line because the difference becomes smaller. And what we see is the patterns are pretty similar, but we do see that the BLS numbers actually suggest a higher employment rate than the UAS rates, and there is about a 2.2% difference. So that difference actually is pretty stable after July. So both UAS and BLS, the numbers don't change much, they get a little better, and the difference is, as I said, about 2.2%. The reason why there is a 2% difference, we don't really know, but one can easily speculate. And one of them is that the BLS definition of employment may be a little more generous than what we asked, because the definition is for the reference week, people have to have worked for at least 1 hour for an employer or in their own business, whereas UAS just asks whether people have a job. And if you work 1 hour in a week, it's not so clear that everyone would say that you have a job. So it may just be a difference in the way questions are asked. And the other thing is you can then still sort of, apart from the difference in level, you can also look how much correlation there is between what you find in the UAS on daily questions and what you find if you aggregate by months, correlate that with BLS. And actually turns out that these correlations during this period, and that's the period after the big dramatic changes, are still pretty high. It's about 88%. So, sort of in conclusion, I wouldn't expect perfection if we ask a simple question in our internet panel, but it feels that if you sort of look at what's happening here, is that it certainly gives you early information and probably pretty good indicators of what you may find in official statistics that typically come out a little later. So now I'll stop here.
Great, thanks very much, Arie. Of course, you can track a lot more than just unemployment statistics with the UAS at the same time, so you can perhaps paint a more broad-brushed picture as well. So I'll open up the floor to questions. Again, please feel free to type them into the chat or raise your hand if you have one. I can start us off. What would you say the policy or the media impact has been of the COVID tracker? It's gotten a lot of attention. Has this also raised attention to the benefits of online probability-based panels?
No, I think the answer is no. So it's and of course, most of our work and most people have used the data were not about the employment part. I was somewhat struck by it. I mean, in some ways, I think the 14.7% is still the headline that people talk about, and generally, that of course that's a big number. And I think, despite the fact that there has been a fair amount of attention, certainly New York Times and the Washington Post and major newspapers wrote about it and explained it, it never has really, I feel, gotten the attention that it deserved. Not so much that, maybe the BLS number wasn't quite what we think reality was, and I think the BLS decision to not change their system, I think, was the right one, because essentially they said, we've always done it like this, we're not suddenly sort of arbitrarily going to change it. But they were very open in explaining what the difference was. And every time, every publication, every month through December, they would always have a paragraph that said, well, if you make the correction, the unemployment rate will actually be not this or that. So, but I still feel that 20% is a different number than 40.7, and it really makes a difference in how you appreciate what's going on in society. So I think I'm surprised that it didn't get more attention simply because of the societal impact.
Yeah. Other questions? Please don't be shy. Well, I'll also open up to questions that anyone has for any of the presenters, or want to draw questions across all the talks. We have a little bit of time left in our session. Or if any of the presenters want to react to any of the other presenters have said or questions you've gotten in the interim, please don't be shy.
To the first presentation, I wanted to ask whether you think that the Social Security Field Office would have the capacity to handle like a big jump in claims when they reopen, if say unemployment benefits are starting to diminish and people start wanting to claim more.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I know it's something that our operations office is really focusing on now. I'm in the research office, so I don't have quite as much insight into the staffing issues, but that's really what's motivating this research. So that's a really good question, and something we hope to be able to answer and to be able to provide some more insight to our operations office. Thank you.
Thanks.